Hello, writers and crafters. I'm Valerie Isan.
And I'm Eric Mertz.
And this is episode 65 of the podcast. And it's April 19th, 2021. As we record this, our main topic today is showing versus telling. Our podcast is sponsored by our patrons at patreon.com/Valerie Isan, IHSAN. For as low as $1 a month, you can get a shout out on the podcast. We can make announcements for you. Other tiers include books, accountability Zoom calls, scene analysis, mastermind calls. It runs the gamut. Go check it out, patreon.com/Valerie Isan. Phew, got that out.
Whoa, did good. That was good.
I'm still reading A Ghost in the Throat. And in the show notes, I'm actually putting a link to a YouTube video where the author is talking about the book. It's a little short video, so it's cool. I think it's neat. Should A
Ghost in the Throat, huh?
Yeah. And then I'm still listening to Run Rose Run, that Dolly Parton book, Parton, James Patterson. So that's still holding my interest.
Cool.
Although,
what about the writing life?
No, today I just got I might have to pause on one or both of those books that I just mentioned because I got another one of those library hold jump the stack books.
Oh, there we go.
Today. So I will be soon reading The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave.
Oh, okay.
So that is
that's the book that moves the list, huh?
That's the book that's going to jump. I keep wanting to say jump the shark. That's not what's happening. It's jumping
different,
the stack.
Very different thing. Yeah, very different thing.
All right.
Cool.
And writing life, I am, actually working on auditioning for narration for audiobooks. I've decided I'm going to start doing that. So that's what I've been working on right now. And I'm again at that excavation stage, pulling out. I have 3 piles of journals over here based on the Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 of the book. So I can pull out of my memoir. So I can pull from, so right now I'm looking through Act 1 journals, trying to pull like raw, emotional data from that and put it in my Scrivener document. And then I'll smooth the edges and so that's the stage I'm at in the memoir.
Interesting. And how does that feel?
Right now, kind of hodgepodgey, going through the old journals is, interesting in some ways and in some ways not, I don't know about your journal writing, but mine's kind of boring and repetitive and whiny, most of the time. And then every once in a while, there's like this, really insightful page or two. And so that's what I'm looking for, are those insightful page or twos in like years of journal writing and pulling those out. And then, like I said, they're, not for consumption. I have to rewrite that stuff. But right now I'm just pulling out the passages.
I imagine I don't journal. Actually, I don't write anything like a continuous stream of thought kind of thing. I guess that's what I think of a journal as, like a log of my thoughts and feelings. I don't keep one. And I think part of it is that like half the time I'm just thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner or when I can take the dog for a walk or what I'm going to, I think my thoughts are so humdrum that I think I would probably like read my own journal and just be like, you're not worthy of your own journal.
Well, that's kind of what's happening. I mean, that's the whole idea of like the morning pages that Julia Cameron set out, was that if you're stuck or if basically it's like the pre-vomit draft, if you've got all these things going on in your head and you're trying to figure out when you have time for this and when you have time for that and what are you gonna have for dinner and you got to pick up the kid and all of this stuff is going on. If you get that out on the page, then it's not floating around in your head so that you have space for the creative other stuff. So that's the idea anyway.
Huh. Well, keep us updated on that. Again, I keep putting it out here, but I have had the thought someday of doing a memoir of my life in social work, and I'm going to have to employ all these tools if I ever do that.
Yeah.
Although, what will I do without a journal? I don't have a journal from that time, I guess I'll just go off of memory, right?
Well, yeah, there's the thing. Like sometimes that's really difficult to do, especially if you're pulling it from a long time ago.
Right. I mean, those are other lives. If you think back to things like high school and like college, I mean, I see pictures of myself, I don't recognize me. So I do, but I don't.
Keep getting all these notifications. I'm going to turn off all this stuff. I don't know if you can hear it or not. It's in my earbuds. No.
I've been reading the book that JP, among other things, the book that JP recommended last week, the How to Write Light Novels and Web Novels by R.A. Patterson. It is really, I think we had a private conversation about like craft books and when we actually read them. I don't read them very often, but this one's a good one. This one's recommended. It's just a really interesting take on writing a different style of fiction, not just a different style of fiction in the way, like in the narrative and the text itself. It addresses that, but it also helps you think of your books as just as like episodic and as as bite-sized, and instead of thinking of it like as a big meal, the novel, it spreads it out like a bunch of lighter things. And I think it's just really interesting, even if you're not writing in that length or going for that sort of delivery. I think it's worth reading just to examine the whole process. So it's definitely worthwhile.
Cool. I will check it out.
Yeah, it's really cool.
The notes were in I guess I'll put it in this show notes too, but they were in
Why not?
They were in the JP episode show notes.
But yeah, and I came up with a name for the next novel in my series. Chasing Shadows will be followed up with Funeral Shadow. Yeah, I was going with Burning Shadows, and I thought that just sounds like such a death metal album. It didn't have like, but Funeral Shadow, it's more, there's the story takes place around multiple funerals, and I thought that was right. Yeah, it was more atmosphere than
heavy
burning, than heavy metal. So I just got in touch with a cover artist today and my cover person, and we're already rolling. We just got to finish the book that comes before it now. So
yeah, I have for this memoir, I have a title and a cover and the ISBN assigned and everything, like Library of Congress number. I have all of it ready.
You got it.
Because I thought that it was going to be ready years ago. And now that it's, kind of morphing a little bit into something deeper than what I had originally imagined, I don't feel like the title really does it anymore.
Right.
Doesn't really say. So that's unfortunate. I'm gonna have to change the cover and the Library of Congress number and
right.
And I'm not even sure how the ISBN thing will work, because if you have a new title, you have to have a new ISBN. So I might have to just chuck that ISBN. I didn't use it for anything.
Or keep that, write another book with that title. Write a book specifically for that title, so you can then turn around. Don't want to waste money. We're small-time entrepreneurs here, so
that's kind of advice. An interesting idea. I'm not even sure how I would do that, but I'll take that into.
You won't. Don't do. That's terrible advice. Like that's at the end of our friendship, Val. Like years later, you're gonna be like, you gave me horrible advice, and this is what happened.
That's a whole other level of writing to market. Writing to title. I don't want to waste my ISBN, so I have to figure out how to make this work. Don't do that. Anyone listening, don't do that. It's probably a bad idea. I just finished. Well, I'm still listening to the 3-Body Problem. I was wondering if you were still on that. Yeah.
It's an interesting book. I'm listening to it, so it's only on walks and gym trips, and it's a long book, so I haven't progressed through it as though I was reading it, but it's a really interesting book. I can see why this gets so much, love and credibility out there in the sci-fi world. It's just like nothing I've ever.
It's a trilogy, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a second and third book. Well, no, I think the original was supposed to be like a trilogy of novellas or something like that. I haven't done too much looking into it. Um, there is something of trilogy-esque with it. I'm sounding like a real like authority on this book. It's really worth reading because it's so sciencey, and I don't normally love the hard science fiction.
Okay.
But this is really compelling. Like I'm through the first part of it, and it deals a lot with revolutionary China. And so it takes the scientific ideas that it seeks to explore, the hard science, and it puts it up against the backdrop of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And so it really shows how the idea, the scientific idea in a different light, than just like pure science. It's not like laboratory science. It's fascinating. So read it. Anybody who likes science fiction, go read that book.
Cool. What about the 1,000 Crimes of Ming? Did you finish that?
Close. I'm getting to the end of it. Really like that one. It's a good one.
Cool.
Yeah, the style is really, it's kind of got a Cormac McCarthy style. You have to really read that. You have to immerse yourself in the style. But it's such a reward. And if you like Westerns, it's great if you just put it up against like other Westerns, it's got that gritty Western feel, but it's very literary and told from a Chinese assassin's point of view, which is not one we get very often. So
that is true.
Yeah, it's a great book. I have the finishing energy when it comes to books, right? I'm at the end of a lot of these. And so I'm
in the middle slog.
the middle slog energy.
There's got to be a better word for that. Like slog energy doesn't seem like
they seem right. Like it's jumbo shrimp, right? It's an oxymoron.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So showing versus telling, that's what we're talking about today.
It's a big one, right? I mean, if you're writing in you're starting writing and you're getting editorial assistance or you're getting assistance from a writer's group, you've probably seen the comment, show this, don't tell this. And that can be really difficult advice to understand what it means. I'm actually working with an editorial client right now, and that was a challenge for her novel. And I remember her coming back to me in the beginning and said, look, I don't know what this means. You've got to help me out here. So I think it's an important thing for us to cover. Yeah.
What does it mean?
Well, it means different things in every instance, right? I mean, I think that what happens a lot in books, what I see a lot in books that I read or early drafts of things, it's the author saying, let's come up with a fictitious character for our example, shall we? Like Joe had an appetite for gambling, right? And that would be the only mention in that story of Joe and his gambling. And for me, when you're writing a novel, like, or any kind of story like that, right there it's kind of just, it's talk about slog. It's not alive. That's not. So for me, showing is showing me, giving me a scene where Joe is playing cards. Joe is, chasing a bad run at craps or something. Like, show me what those things mean. Telling me that your character is something, does something, telling me that they want something is not enough. You have to show that desire or that flaw in action at some point. Otherwise, it's not real.
I think also that when writers tell rather than show, they are doing two things. One you've touched on already. So they're summarizing. Right. So they're going through a it's like the campfire thing. It's a very oral tradition sort of thing. So they're just
Right.
telling the story of, then he did this, and then he said this, and then he went and did this, and then this happened. And that's how the manuscript is written when someone is using the telling. And that's not very interesting. And
No.
I find that readers tend to skim over that because they're trying to get to the scene where it happens rather than being told after the fact. So the skimming will happen if you're telling, which is certainly not what we want our readers to do. We want them to be engaged. And then also the scene work isn't there. So it's
the opposite of scene work, right? It's summarizing a series of scenes or events that would otherwise compel the reader.
Right. The scene's not there. So as an editor, I run across this fairly often, and a really important moment gets passed over very quickly. They'll say like 2 sentences, 3 sentences that really needs an entire chapter.
Right.
And those are the moments that are monumental to the story. Like the whole book is leading up to this one thing and just went through it in a paragraph. Give me a whole chapter on this. So those are the 2 problems I see in telling versus showing. It's not interesting. You're skimming through it. It's not in scene. And you need more scene, like it's a,
right.
They just pass over things that are super important and lose the opportunity to make it a really powerful event in the reader's expectation.
Right. And I think you're hitting on something. Like, I think as a writer, well, all of this should be prefaced by saying you do have to summarize some things in a story, right? I mean, I'm working on in my current manuscript, I have a lot of, a character is going from place to place to place. I don't need to create a scene around every time he gets in a car. I don't have to describe the road, the weather, all that stuff. You don't have to do that. If there's nothing remarkable happening in the drive, you can summarize that quickly. If you're going from a scene, you can say, Joe, it took 20 minutes for Joe to get from the bar to the library. Sounds like a great afternoon. But, you can summarize that, because if nothing happens on that drive, it's not important. It's simply something your reader doesn't need to know. But the things your reader needs to know are where the scene work needs to live. The life of the story needs to live. If Joe gets into an altercation over an overdue book, we want to see that, right? I mean, for all the comic, tragic, whatever value is in there, we have to see it. And you don't want your readers, your reader's going to skim over that stuff if you're just summarizing what happens. I think the other thing that happens is that it doesn't, too much telling really removes the writer's authority, I think, because it doesn't, to tell the story, to really paint the picture. If you're not painting a picture if you're not painting a picture that the reader is going to be engaged in, then when you do choose, because I'll see that happen a lot of summary, and then the author wants to get in and really drive a scene home, and they'll put a lot of energy into this particular scene. And I find that, like, as a reader, you haven't built up to that really big scene. You can't summarize the whole story till that big scene and then expect to immerse me, because I don't know the character or situation. And I haven't really been, I haven't been sort of carried into that scene. I just get dropped into it. So I think there's a lot of, like, you just don't have a lot of authority in your narrative.
I think that when I am drafting at the very beginning, I do a lot of telling, because I know what's coming. I want to get it out on the paper. I'm going to put it in scene later, but I just want to get it out. And so I think that maybe that's what happens to some writers. Like, they do that initial drafting and somehow they make those words sound pretty
Right.
And it makes sense because, you see it in your head, how the story goes, and you can kind of imagine the scene, and that's what you've summarized on the page, and
Right.
just gets left behind. It just sort of is oops, I forgot to do that part of the editing. So maybe
Well,
that's what happens.
Yeah. And if you've given some thought to the character, then that, if Joe's a gambler, you want to make sure the reader knows that. So that's part of that maybe early drafting process where the writer says, oh, I know Joe's a gambler. Joe was a gambler.
Yeah.
And so I think, what does Neil Gaiman say? The first draft is just you telling the story to yourself. And if that is true, then, and, I think we talk a lot about, when we talk about craft, we talk about, like, here you are at your first draft. What do you do now? I think this is one of those things. You have to read through that book and say, am I showing this scene right here, or am I telling it? Another place I see it happen a lot is where people will, I think they do a lot of showing, oh boy, how do I put it? It's in dialogue. I find there's a lot of people who, a lot of overwriting in dialogue. And I think that's a lot of showing, like a lot of that, you'll see like these long passages where characters will speak everything and they will just overly narrate what's happening. And I take that to be the kind of the same way, is that there's, if a character is like shouting a lot, or it's an emotionally heated scene, and there's just these like when people are angry, they don't speak in long passages. Usually it's usually a lot more pointed. So showing me the character is animated in a conversation, or angry or overjoyed in a conversation, comes out in action. Yeah. So, so that's another one of those places. Show me the character's affect while they're communicating, versus telling me their affect through their dialogue, which never sounds natural.
Yeah. I mean, oftentimes, like you said, you're not going to say out loud, I'm so angry. Or, I mean, maybe you are, but but that's not good.
That's
writing.
A different, yeah, that's not but that's a different kind of conversation, right? I mean, those are.
But you can show that anger with, slamming doors and stomping around, and actually that emotional thesaurus. I don't know if you have that book yet or not, but that's the one that I don't either, but I keep hearing about it. It's on my wish list. But it has all of so if you have an emotion, it's cross-referenced. So you can look up an emotion and then see what happens in the body. Yeah. So, okay. You know what I mean? So, and they also do it from the perspective of what it looks like. So if somebody else in the scene, not the protagonist or not the main character, sees someone angry, what does it look like? So we can put that in the scene, stomping around or slamming doors,
right.
Is the eyes bulging,
balled up fists,
the
those
nostrils flaring, or is there a tick that they always do when they're mad, like something like that. And then the internal stuff for the protagonist, like what does anger feel like in your body? Is it I can't take a whole breath? Is it I'm really hot? Is it I don't know. What happens when you're angry? What does it feel like, Eric?
Well, boy, now this is a different kind of conversation.
Okay, moving on.
Moving on. Well, I think that's again like where the scene work comes in. Now that you're in the mode of showing the reader what's happening, then you have to have that sort of psychological depth. That if you are in a point of view with a character, you're going to have to know what that looks like from the inside and the outside. You're going to have to know those reactions. And that is so much more vivid, right? Joe is in the library. He's angry about his overdue fines. He's got a vein bulging out of his head. That's Joe angry. Instead of saying Joe was angry at the library because of his overdues, that's a scene. We want to see that. And we want to immerse into that.
Another problem with telling, or so how do you know if you're telling and not showing? If the story contains too much info dumping, that's all telling. So if it's backstory or I got to make sure that they understand this about the world, that's not scene work unless you write it that way.
Right.
Like we were talking about in the world building episode, where instead of saying it was a, small rural town, you can show the dust, and you can see the sign on the barber shop that's faded, and you can see the,
Right.
so you can say that it's rural without, you can show that it's rural without saying so.
Right. Right. And I think there's, these are hard things. I'm thinking about manuscripts I've looked at, and certainly some of my own, where that info dumping, which is the epitome of telling,
right,
is, I think a lot of people mistake that for world building. I think it's an easy thing to do, to say, well, people need to know the magic system, or people need to know the science involved. But like, going back to what I said about the 3-body problem, there's a lot of science in that book, and nobody is, I'm being shown what that is, and the little bit of telling that comes into it is at the emotional peak of a scene, or it's the I don't want to give away sort of the energy of the book too much, but a lot of people are arguing science for their lives, and so while I'm learning the necessary science for the book, I'm also watching characters develop. That's world building in a showing, not telling way. And not everybody can meet that standard. That's a book bound to be a classic, but I think we can all sit down and look at that necessary information and find more urgent ways to deliver it.
So let's come up with an example of a reader experiencing the story,
right,
by being shown the emotional journey of the character. Like, what would that look like? If
so in a hypothetical example, what does the emotional journey in a scene or sequence of scenes look like in a showing?
Yeah.
Way. Well, I think it starts with, we have to know the character at least identify the character in the world. So we have to be familiar with them. We have to know what part of what the problem is, right? So once we have that, I think it's scene description, right? It's brief and adequate scene description that puts the character in a place, right? It's a problem the character's dealing with in that scene, and it shows either a behavior or a hesitance that we understand. Joe is a gambler. Like, if we are showing Joe gambling in that example we talked about, the scene is him standing outside of the pool hall. It's him identifying the people who may be easy people to win money off of. It's the feeling like I have to go in there and hustle them. It's entering, so there's a sequence of things happening there. I don't have to tell the reader at that point that Joe's a gambler, or that he's got that itch, because I'm seeing it all the way. Now, if Joe wins a bunch of money and that moves the story forward, you've moved the story forward by showing that key piece of behavior. If Joe gets beat up and that affects what he does in the next scene, then the same thing happens. So whether or not it's an up or down finish, you're still showing that reader the most important parts of your character, and probably with some you do need some of that. You do need to tell in there a little bit. You do need to tell us what they're thinking, or tell us what the room looks like, but that quickly has to be joined to some sort of showing of action.
Well, and you can also show what the room looks like without telling, by having the character interact with that environment.
Right.
If the character is like in a hurry, like frantically trying to get something done, and turns around and stumbles over, I don't know,
the torn carpet
or something like that, and barks his shin on the coffee table or whatever, like, that's interacting with the environment. Now we know that there's a coffee table there, and we didn't have to say in the room was a
right. Okay. I mean? Yeah, that kind of description. Yeah, that's true. And all of that accomplishes, showing and tell. I think something that goes without saying, but like showing and telling accomplish the same elementary goal, right? We learned something about Joe. We learned something about the room. We learned something about the action. It's just in showing the reader all of that. It's emotional. It's compelling. It's engrossing. So, yeah.
I think that in scene is the key point, and you went over a lot of those just a minute ago. So
right.
If we break down the basics of a scene, what is a scene?
Right.
You have a specific place that
right.
you're in. There are people or animals in this room or place, and it lasts for a specific amount of time.
Right.
Mostly. Sometimes there's
a unit of
scenes.
action. Yeah.
And like you said, something happens in that scene.
Right.
And they're going from one value to another, like negative to positive, or negative to negative, or whatever. They get what they need or they don't. And so anything that you would tell or summarize could be put with rewriting into scene.
Absolutely.
And you would recreate dialogue, or you would recreate action. I like to look at it. This was years and years and years ago, like one of my very first writing classes I ever went to. And the light bulb, as a brand new baby writer, the light bulb really went off for me when you realize that to write a scene, you have to see it like a movie.
Right.
And so recognizing that if I turn my, inner eyes into cameras, then I could just write down whatever I saw. And that would really help it go a long way toward scene building.
Right. Right. And I think also, I think of that example, the king died and then the queen died is a sequence of events, but the king died and the queen died 2 weeks later of grief is a story, right? Because there's an emotional element, there's a journey there, and so I think that's like, that happens in a book, that also happens in a scene, right? It has to start with, there's a reason why you start a scene in a moment, right? You don't, like I was saying earlier, like I have a lot of scenes with a character driving around. You don't start every scene with the moment the character wakes up in the morning, or so you have to cut, you're making a decision about, where do I start this at the most compelling moment, or is it right after the big compelling moment? Is it right before? And then you sort of start the scene there. So you have a choice of when you turn on those cinematic eyes, because you're telling, you don't want to tell a sequence of events. Joe got up, Joe took a shower, Joe made a cup of coffee, he was out of cream. Those are unimportant, unless that lack of cream throws his day off. And then, those are choices. You have to find where the compelling moment in that begins. It's like the screenwriting thing where they say, always start a scene as late as possible and end it as early as possible, because all that other stuff isn't really all that interesting. Even though there are writers who can make all that boring stuff seem interesting, and those people's powers are beyond their mere mortals. But I think for most writing, like that's what you got to think of. Use your eyes like movie. I like that. I'm going to use that from now on.
Like movie cameras.
With a good editor. Right?
Yeah.
This is challenging. This is challenging stuff, because I think that you said something earlier that I think we could talk about all day, and that's that in your head, as you're telling the story in your head and you're putting it down, it's familiar to the writer, and so we lose that eye that really says, is this the way this should sound? Does this sound like the books that I love? So I think that the challenge is then, if you're looking at your manuscript and you have that advice, you have that note from your writer's group, you're showing, not telling, that one of the key skills is just taking yourself out of, like, you just heard from somebody that doesn't know the book like you. So you have to listen to that. What could they mean? What am I not seeing? So giving yourself some distance from that is key, I think. I would, especially this, because again, you know the story, it's all there to you. But
other things that we can consider when we are showing versus telling are concrete sensory details.
oh yeah.
So really landing the reader in that scene. You want to put them in the room, and the way to do that is with the senses.
Right.
So that will anchor them in the story if they know what something smells like, or if they know, what something felt like to the touch when, I don't know.
Yeah.
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 I'm
No,
blanking
yeah.
on a specific example, but those are, I think those are so key to creating scene and showing versus telling.
There's a short story. I'm blanking on the name of the author. It's like not Raymond Chandler, one of those classic short story types, but it starts with the smell of fresh cut grass. You never lose that sense the whole story, and that's all you need. But there's something about that line in the opening sentence, that just that inclusion, the sense in the opening sentence, that it's just the scene is so immediate because of that, because that's so key. So yeah, that's a great idea. If none of the senses are involved, then you're not really in the space. I think every manuscript, every writer has its unique challenge with showing versus telling. I think sometimes it's getting out of a scene too early, like writing that end, like you're also is a bit of showing and not, or telling, not showing. Like so it's knowing the length of your scene, it's including everything, it's getting it all the way to its end. Yeah, we could talk about this for a really long time, but
I think that scene work is really key to the showing and the concrete sensory details in the scene, because I know when I'm writing, sometimes, especially in memoir, memories are like these little snapshots, these little like bubbles, that pop up in my memory, and I write those down, and even those can have lots of concrete sensory detail and dialogue and such, but it doesn't come to like a natural scene conclusion before I'm off to the next thing. It's almost like montage, like in a movie montage. A lot of my early draft memoirs look like that, just montages of stuff where it's just
very impressionistic and
it doesn't actually go anywhere. It's good for emotional tone maybe, but but it's not good on pacing, and there's no like forward trajectory in the plot. So I think that when you're writing in scene, like you said, like coming to the end of it, like actually putting all of it in there is another skill that we just need to develop. Yeah.
And I think this would be something that even novelists should just watch movies. I mean, look at the way a movie scene is set up for maximum anticipation in the beginning, maximum emotional effect in the end, how it builds. We could, I think that's what the great cinematic artists do, is they create little units of drama. That's what a scene is, that are compelling, and then they build something big out of a bunch of those. If your scenes are not looking, if your chapters and stories are not looking like movie scenes, then that's not like, you don't need to draft them like a screenplay. But if it's not anchored in the five senses and with some emotional arc, then you're probably telling a lot more than you are showing to your readers.
So I've heard in the writing industry, often craft books for novels. Well, how do I say this? Reading books on screenplay writing is good for novel writing, also for that pacing and for the things that you just said. So what do you recommend as a screenplay writer? What books would you recommend that would help a novelist
There's two that come right to my mind, and I'm looking at them. My bookshelf is up above my camera, so I can look at them.
I thought you were being pensive, like, let me think.
Well, there's a book called Thinking in Pictures by John Sayles. It's the making of movie. What is it? I've read it so many times. The spine is faded. The making of the movie Matewan. So what John Sayles, who is a novelist, a screenwriter, and a film director, and he's good at all of those things. He's a real classic. He takes a movie that he did early in his career called Matewan, and he developed it out of a book that he'd written into a screenplay. And so he talked about the process of taking narrative fiction and turning it into pictures, and really like how to think of how he thought of each scene in the book as a series of pictures, images, impressions, giving each character, a character says something, you see another character's reaction. He talked about the importance of all of those things. That movie, Matewan, is a classic, and it's a immersive movie. It's really fantastic. And it's a perfect example of for a novelist, because I think that it's not like Indiana Jones style adventure. It's a very contemplative, it's a story about coal mining in the Depression. So it's a character piece, but it's very visual. So I would read that book. And then Story by Robert McKee is kind of the gospel of screenwriting. Screenwriters have taken that book and kind of made it the gospel. But if you read that book, what Robert McKee often talks about is you talk about it a lot too, starting a scene on a negative and ending on a positive, or starting in the middle and ending. He talks a lot about scenes. When you're doing a movie, you can't have straight lines. Every scene you have to have a lot of jaggedness, and it's ascending or it's descending. And so I think that he talks a lot about the emotional arc of things, just like the characters, and how to do like sort of different arcs for different characters. It's beautiful writing. And honestly, it's one of the best audiobooks you'll ever get. So if you can find Robert McKee's audiobook for Story, he reads it, and he's just got this old bluster to him. He sounds like an old general. And so I used to listen to it while driving. I think it was really inspiring stuff, but to the point that it's informative, and it's clear. It's just clear. So I would read that book. Love it.
Cool. That's exciting.
Yeah. I may actually start reading it again, because I think I've probably read each of those books multiple times. They're so fun. So yeah.
Maybe we'll start a book club.
We should. Oh, that would be so great. I'm not joking. I think that's a great idea. Craft books. We should start a craft book club, and then maybe not a craft book club.
I like that idea. I just know a couple of other podcasts that do it already, so I didn't.
Oh no! Dang!
But I love the idea.
Yeah.
We should still do
that
it.
Means
it won't have our spin on it.
No. Yeah.
All right.
I think
takeaways.
Oh boy, takeaways for showing, not telling. I think finding separation between how you think of the story and how the story is being told is really key skill, right? Because if you're married to this idea that's going to be like this, and you're getting that advice, you've got to look past your vision of the telling.
And the concrete sensory details, I really think that's important.
Yeah.
And like internal dialogue, I think really helps too, because if you can get into the character's head,
right,
and body, then you're more likely to be in a place, and you're not going to skim by it with just telling.
And I think that often, we didn't touch on this, but now we are. Mm-hmm. I think often that mental processing is thought of as telling, right? And I think, when you're going through a character's thoughts, or the character is reflecting, but it's really not. It's showing an emotional. It's showing an emotional depth. It's showing a thought process. Its thoughts are concrete. They're concrete. If a character is sitting in there saying, "What did I do wrong?" Joe should have done it. Knew he should have done it differently. That's not That's not telling.
That's not telling. That's internal dialogue.
Right. That's showing a thought that you can't do any other way. So don't lose the interior life of the character to this idea that you have to show everything.
I just want to circle back really quickly on one other thing you said at the beginning, and that there are places in your book where you will quote unquote tell, and those are places. There are places in your book where you're not writing in scene on purpose, and so some of those places would be that sequel in between the scenes, that place where there is reflection happening on what just happened in this last scene. Exposition is kind of the same too.
You need a little of that.
Yeah. Like you said, like the time is moving past and you just need to represent that with a couple of sentences or something like that, but they're not in a specific time and place while they're doing it. So it's not seen. It's just sort of the extra bits in between.
Yeah.
And description too, that's not seen, but it's some telling, but there's enough concrete sensory detail in it, hopefully, that you don't ramble on about the visual of a certain place and not put the character or the reader in it. Flashbacks, I don't know, arguably those are scenes of themselves. They're just like a backstitch of a scene.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But sometimes they're just a couple sentences that interrupt the scene to remind the reader of something that had happened before. So that wouldn't be a scene. It would just be, again, those little bits of telling to remind the reader or the character of something that had happened before.
I think a flashback as showing in just the same way we talked about with internal, the way the characters' thought processes work. You're showing their thought process, and then you're showing that they are traveling back in time in a thought to referencing something. It's like a thought. It is a thought. So can't miss out on that stuff, because if the past is a rich part of your story, which it probably is, then you have to represent it. Just don't get carried away.
Well, and we can also use that checklist for the ubiquitous checklist of, if it doesn't carry the story forward, or if it doesn't do character development, then you got to cut it. So then
it's got to go,
whether it's seen or not.
Have you seen that meme that's going around with it's the writers, it's like a video, it's like a writer going through the second draft, and there's like all these, the word darling is everywhere, and she just goes and she just shoots all the darlings out. And I thought that was so great. But it's true, like you might love that little bit of that little scene, and I'm the king of those scenes, right, where it's just like this little precious bit of local history, or it's a little navel gazing that just seems so precious. Gotta go.
My favorite thing to do with those, which I had to cut out of my novel, there was like 3 or 4 of them, beautifully written, totally seen, everything, it's gorgeous, but it didn't, like, it was just what do they call those shoe leather scenes? Like it's just a throwaway. Nothing's actually happening. I mean, there's something happening, but it doesn't carry the story. It doesn't matter. You could take it out and the story is exactly the same. So those, my favorite thing to do with are to give them to my mailing list. Put them in a PDF and slap a little cover on the front of it and just book funnel it to my mailing list. And it's a good book launch thing too, I think. Before your book comes out, you can give your readers like a teaser of, I've seen people do that with first chapters, which I think is great, but also like, this is what didn't make it to the book, and if you are reading those deleted scenes, then I don't know, maybe that's a thing to do after a person reads a book. I'm not sure.
I would say that's for after. Yeah, that would be like a little follow-up. Especially, you could probably, if it really is, this should be a topic we talk about, what to do with those sort of, with the B-sides. But I think if it's truly outside,
as Mark Dawson calls them,
right, you can probably take that, and if it's so far out of the story, you probably have another narrative that you could patch together, and then that can be your teaser, your lead magnet. Just saying.
True. Yeah. Like one of the scenes was one of the main characters, Heather, she's a banjo player, and so she was just changing the banjo strings in the backyard. So I did all this research on like how to like restring a
go.
banjo.
Somewhere the writing gods knew that you did a bunch of research and they like just, you can't use that scene.
So I put it in my deleted scenes file.
Oh, that's cool. I'm
But
sure
yeah.
somebody loved it.
It was fun to write.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for talking to me about showing versus telling. And
Absolutely.
If you guys have any
pleasure.
listeners, if you have any other ideas about showing versus telling or things that work well for you when you're in that process of rewriting, go into our Facebook group, the Writercraft Facebook group, and put that there, or you can put it in the comments of the YouTube video you're watching or in the show notes comment section on the webpage, valerieeson.com/podcast-news. Happy writing.
Happy writing to you.
See you next time.
Have a great week.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.